call me loser because they love to spread hate. They call me stupid because I didn't graduate. I'm only what I need, certified GED. They call me alcoholic because I like to...
Mortal Kombat was the very first game that ever had me completely whipped into a frenzy. The first time I ever saw it, and a Pizza Hut of all places on an arcade machine, I was completely blown away. The digitized graphics, the bone-crushing sounds, the blood, the fatalities, the super cool characters. It was everywhere. In the magazines, everywhere you looked, Mortal Kombat was all over the place. And then, suddenly the magazines started saying it was coming home to Super Nintendo and Sega. And it was true. And everybody was excited. And I couldn't get it. While we had Street Fighter, my mother said Mortal Kombat was too bloody of a game. Now, it came out for the Super Nintendo, the Sega, and the Sega CD, and there was a lot of argument about it. Some folks had Super Nintendo, and they said it was the best. Other folks had Sega. They said, well, that one's got the blood code. And I didn't know anybody that had the Sega CD. But I've got all of them now, and today I want to see which one is the king. If you were a kid and you had them, which was superior? So, let's find out and take a look at the first Mortal Kombat games.
The first Mortal Kombat hit the scene in 1992, and right off the bat had everybody all sorts of hot and bothered. We had 7 playable characters, 2 non-playable bosses, and a non-playable special character and Reptile, although video game magazines always teased that there was some sort of special way to get them. This game had not as many characters as Street Fighter 2, but the ones it did have were really cool. They all had neat stories and cool moves. Now, the graphics at this time were unlike anything else that you would see in the arcades, and the sound and everything else and the presentation that went with it had this wrapped up into a package that appealed to a lot of gamers at the time. Now, the moves were really neat, and the fatalities is what had everybody talking. You were able to kill your opponent in all sorts of brutal ways, and your opponents looked super realistic. This obviously bothered some people, so this is one of the main reasons that we have ratings on games today. Now, Acclaim got the rights to bring this home to home consoles, and after a lot of hoopla, hype, commercials, a music video, everything else, on September 13th, 1993, Mortal Monday, the game finally hit the scene. Now, other versions came out a little bit later, including the Sega CD, but today, the console versions we're going to talk about, we're just talking about Super Nintendo, Genesis, and Sega CD. Let's go ahead and start with the Genesis. Now, Mortal Kombat on the Genesis, I'll go ahead and get the whole blood code thing out of the way. The Genesis version had blood enabled. Once the code thing came up at the beginning, you typed in ABA-CABB, and you instantly had all the blood and fatalities. Now, if you didn't do that, you got a pretty censored version, and you got censored fatalities as well. Now, the one thing I will say about the Genesis, now the graphics aren't as good as the arcade, but nobody was ever going to expect it at the time. But it looks pretty solid for a Genesis game. The one thing is the sprites are kind of small, but then again, that is a limitation of home hardware. The game plays pretty well, and even on a 3-button controller, I'm able to play it, I'm able to get through it. It doesn't take anything away from it. Now, the music in this one is definitely pretty crappy, and compared to the other ones at the bottom of the pile. Although, it feels really tight when you play in a good way. So, on that aspect, the presentation is just fine. And one thing that's cool about the Genesis version is your Dullard code with your cheats enabled. And you're able to do all sorts of neat things like one-hit kills, set the place that you want to fight. You're able to do more of the test your might kind of stuff. Overall, it's not bad. Years ago, I worked at a pawn shop, and before I had a Sega CD, I was able to come across a copy of this game for like $2. I was super excited about it because I assumed that the Sega CD version was going to be far superior and totally awesome to the other home consoles that were out. Now, This one here, it definitely let me down. It's got the music video in the intro, and I read that some people thought that was cool, but it's that crappy FMV Sega CD presentation. Horrible. Also, the loading in this game is a joke at so many points. It's about 10 seconds for it to load for your match to start, which isn't the end of the world because most CD-based games you gotta wait anyway, but there's so much loading at other parts, it takes away from the presentation. When I played through this the other night, I had the code on, the one-hit kill, and it still took me forever to get through the game simply because it took so long to load. I wasn't even to the endurance rounds yet, and I was totally bored with it and ready to turn it off. But I persevered. Now, this one doesn't have the blood code. The game comes ready to go. You can turn the blood off with the dullard code. But other than that, it doesn't really look any better than the Sega Genesis. And if it does look better, it's marginal. But the loading, when you're waiting during endurance rounds for the other person to come out, fatalities have to load. It's absolutely silly. It's got some more sound bites than the original, but it's no better by any stretch of the imagination. There's little details that are cool, like the names are in the life bars, which the Genesis doesn't have. Some of the stage backgrounds maybe do look a little bit better. In the pit, there's more of the body parts and stuff, which is kind of cool and more true to the arcade. But this is not by any means a version that I would suggest to anybody. If you've already got a Sega CD, that means you got the Genesis hooked up, so get the Genesis version. If you didn't have the Genesis version and had the Sega CD, I guess I understand, but this is one that I would say is definitely for collectors or fans only. Here's Mortal Kombat on the SNES, and this is the one that I had played the first out of the home console versions. My neighbor had it, and I would play it with him after school all the time, and we were huge fans of it. Now, this one did come out with like X-Pac heat, as far as because it didn't have the blood and fatalities that the other versions had. And unlike the Genesis version, you didn't have access to a blood code to give that to you. And I will say, the fatalities, these censored fatalities in this game are pretty dumb. The Sub-Zero one's pretty cool, the Raiden one's pretty cool, but compared to the originals, they're definitely not all that great. It's the best looking of the three by far, which surprised me because I would have figured the Sega CD would be a lot closer to the arcade version, but we know that's not true. I think it has the best sound of the group compared to even the Sega CD version, which was supposed to have, from what I understand, arcade perfect CD quality music. It's very smooth. Now, it does feel a bit laggy at times, and it may be slightly less tight than the Genesis version, but the one thing about Mortal Kombat 1, especially compared to its sequel, is that Mortal Kombat 1 just kind of does feel laggy at times in general. Now, this version here, if you were to own a Super Nintendo and a Genesis, and I did as a kid, I would have preferred this version over the other one. But if you wanted the blood, you wanted the arcade style fatalities, then, you know, the Genesis was definitely a better option. But as far as the presentation goes, the Super Nintendo, had it had the blood and everything else, there'd be no contest. We wouldn't even be talking about it anymore. I think hands down, in Mortal Kombat 1, the Super Nintendo is the clear winner. It had the best graphics, the best sound, even better than the Sega CD in my opinion. The only thing it didn't have was the fatalities and the blood that the other ones did. Had it had that, there'd be no argument. I can see where people got maybe a more true Mortal Kombat experience with blood and fatalities on the other ones. But then again, if you didn't know the code for the Sega Genesis and CD, then it didn't matter anyway. You got a really heavily censored version as well. Now, Nintendo did make up for screwing that up, and when Mortal Kombat 2 came out, they had completely redeemed themselves and put out a really fantastic port at the time. Does it hold up as much today? Not as much, but at the same time, at the time, it was way, way superior. Same with Mortal Kombat 3, the Super Nintendo had the best port, and overall, it was a lot more fun to play. So, what's your take? Were you a fan of the blood, guts, and fatalities of the Genesis version, or a better looking experience on the SNES? Make sure you let us know in the comments below. And make sure you like and subscribe to our videos. We got lots of new stuff coming, so stay tuned and see what we got. But until then, see you next time.